Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. Today I'm going to talk about noticing. And many of you have heard me say that the three key elements in language learning are number one, the attitude of the learner. Are you motivated? Do you like the language? Do you have confidence that you're going to succeed? Are you resisting the language or are you just letting it come in? All of these attitudinal things are the most important. The second thing is how much time you are prepared to spend with the language. With the language, that doesn't mean necessarily in a classroom. It means with the language, listening to it, reading, speaking, time with the language. And the third thing is learning to notice. But I think the more people have trouble understanding that third principle. So I want to discuss it a little bit with reference to my recent effort to improve in Portuguese. Remember that I said I would try to improve my Portuguese because I want to make a video in Portuguese, and Portuguese is not one of my stronger languages. It's down near the bottom there, a language that I have kind of spent time learning over the last 4 or 5 years, more or less relying on my Spanish, pronouncing it more or less like Spanish, and so I decided I would try to step it up a notch. And so what did I do? Well, one of the first things I did was that I found, what have I bought over the years? Because I have always bought lots of language learning material. So Pimsleur is one. I have Pimsleur, by the way, for Portuguese and Russian. I have a number of these things. I have Asimil for Russian and Korean. I have lots. So when I comment on them, I comment from some experience. I've always been not a great fan of Pimsleur because it has so little vocabulary in it that it would take forever to learn a language. To me, in language learning, I want to have a big vocabulary so that I can understand people, so that I can understand what I read, and so that I can then continue to increase my vocabulary, because the more you know, the more you can learn. However, the one good thing about Pimsleur is that the sound quality of the recordings is excellent. You have to put up with the English that's on the CDs, but the Portuguese, the target language, sound quality is excellent, and the words repeat so that you can really start to notice how things are pronounced. So that in Brazilian Portuguese, it's not como, it's como. The O is in fact an U. It's not o hotel, it's u hotel. It's not do Brazil, it's do Brazil. So these kinds of things that you sometimes don't notice, or you do know they're there, but you don't pay much attention. You hear them on Pimsleur. Then when I go back into listening to other more interesting stuff, I find myself noticing some of those aspects of pronunciation more. So it helps me to notice. Similarly, I'm not going to reach for it here, but I have my Teach Yourself Portuguese. I went through that very quickly. The first time I looked at that 5 years ago or so, it made some impression on me. But I have listened to a lot of Portuguese since then, so that now those descriptions of grammar in that book now refer to something that I'm familiar with. So in fact, it does, again, quote, help me to notice, because I see it there. I haven't really absorbed it, but it makes me a little more sensitive to it, so that when I'm listening and reading, I say, oh yeah, right, that's that aspect. That's what they call the personal infinitive or something. So I might underline it if I'm reading, or I might pay attention while I'm listening. Along those lines, verbs are a problem for a learner in Portuguese. And so there is a very nice site that I have now on my iPad here. It's called Conjuga-me. Conjuga as in conjugate, conjuga-me, M-E, me. And there you punch in any verb and you have the full conjugation of all the different tenses, and anything that's irregular is in orange. And they also help you a little bit, for example, for the future subjunctive, quando eu esquecer or quando tu esqueceres, so that they help you with it. So in all, I just think it's an excellent tool. Here again, I find I can't remember from studying these lists, but it does help me to notice. So I start to notice a little more when I'm listening, how the AR verbs, ER verbs, IR verbs perform in different tenses. So all of these things help me to notice. However, these are like, as I would say, that's like the 20% activity. The 80% activity is just the massive reading and listening. And armed with this, having become a little more alert because of looking at the nuts and bolts, then I become a little more attentive when I'm listening and reading. My main activity has been massive listening and reading. And today I worked all day in the garden. Actually, I'm quite exhausted. And so I had my Nano here, and I had these wonderful wireless headphones, so I didn't cut anything and didn't get entangled in the bushes or anything while I was listening, although I was sweating profusely. And I was listening to the Kite Runner in Portuguese. Again, some years ago when I got interested in Portuguese, I sent away for some audiobooks from Brazil, and this is one of the ones that I got. It's okay. The other day, I was listening in my car to A Arte da Guerra, which... my wife now has gone to Toronto to visit with her family, so I'm doing a lot of work around the house, cleaning things up and that sort of thing. I played a couple of games of golf with friends, so unfortunately, my friends don't appreciate it if I listen while we're playing golf, but it's a 40-minute drive there, 40-minute drive back. I'm listening. There was another one of my favorites many years ago when I was 4 or 5 years ago. It was Rubem Alves, who is a Brazilian educator. So I listened to a bit of him. And this I didn't like so much. It was an audiobook that I ordered from Brazil, but I listened to a bit of it. But the point is, and my reading, I don't have it all here. I found some of the Portuguese books that I bought in the past. Unfortunately, both these books are translations. These are books, because when I was in Portugal, I like to buy books on subjects that interest me. I'm not normally a big reader of fiction, although I have a book by Paulo Coelho, and I must admit that I just don't like his stuff very much. So I read this book about the brain and how the brain learns and stuff, even though it's a translation from English. So I read a bit of that to get myself going, and I also had, because I'm interested in Russia and the Soviet Union, here's a book by Martin Amis on Stalin, again in translation into Portuguese. So it really doesn't matter what you read. If you're exposing yourself to it all the time, I'm trying to notice. And when I'm listening or when I'm reading, if I see things that I know that I have trouble with, like the subjunctive, like verbs, like which form of the past tense to use when, all these kinds of things that I will occasionally consult with my teach yourself or look up my table on my iPad, then when I'm listening and reading, I want to be paying attention. And what happens is that, as I've said before, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. As more of the pieces fall into place, you're able to notice more and more things. It's not because you saw an explanation or saw a declension table that you're going to remember it, but as you are now, let's say, very comfortable with a certain case, or not case, but a certain tense or certain vocabulary items, then other things that were just lost in all the stuff you couldn't really understand or make sense of, now those things start to stand out and you start to notice them. So that the discovery of a language is all about helping yourself notice more and more things. Whether it be noticing how things are pronounced, whether it be noticing how words are used. One thing I started to notice is, I think it's acrescentar, I don't remember which, but it doesn't really mean to increase, it means to add, like someone adds that in a conversation. So I hear in my audiobook, acrescentou or acrescente, I can't remember now which it is. But acrescentar, whatever it is, acrescentar or acrescentar, means to add. It doesn't mean to increase. Aumentar is to increase. So you start to notice things with regard to vocabulary and how it's used. What was another one that I started noticing about the usage? Because it doesn't matter. But you start to notice things in vocabulary. You start to notice things in terms of grammar. Now, many of these things are fleeting. It's not because you notice it once that you're able to use it. But the more you notice it, the more you kind of trigger a slight aha, I believe, the more you are forging sort of neural networks that are going to enable you to come up with it correctly when you're speaking. So, Basically, talked a little bit about how I'm refreshing my Portuguese and how I go about trying to improve my ability to notice what's happening in Portuguese, in the hope that as I notice more and more things, and maybe notice and forget and notice again, and as you can see, I couldn't remember certain things. It doesn't matter to me. I never worry about what I can't remember, because I know that as I go over it again and go over it again and notice it here and notice it there, eventually it is going to stick. And so by maybe making that special deliberate effort to notice, you're going to make things stick a little faster. But ultimately, I want to end on this note. Ultimately, it's that massive input that's going to do it. It's not deliberately trying to study every form of the verb and sitting there and I don't, like, I've never, like, write it out longhand 10 times. It's not that in-depth study, in my opinion. It's more the sort of, it's quantity over quality, because not only are you then exposing yourself to that particular verb ending in different situations, but as you're listening to it, you're also reviewing all of the other words and making your brain more and more familiar with how the language works. So there you have it about noticing. I hope that was useful. And this weekend, I promise I will do my video in Portuguese. And tonight, I'm having dinner with a Brazilian couple. So thank you for listening. Bye for now.